After months of siege, the German troops defending the city began to push back the Soviet army, which had been on the verge of victory. The Soviets now faced a revitalized German force, which included everyone from elderly men to children, recruited as a last resort. In Hitler's bunker, the mood shifted from defeat to hope. The leader of Germany, who had previously considered defeat and even suicide, now felt a surge of energy. He believed that victory in Europe was close and was determined to seize this opportunity. However, Berlin was just one battle in a much larger war. In Northern Europe, the Allies had launched a massive invasion in June 1944 called Operation Overlord. This aimed to drive the Germans out of Western Europe, starting with Normandy in France. The plan involved hundreds of thousands of soldiers from the US, Canada, and the United Kingdom. However, they faced strong resistance and supply issues across the English Channel. By the end of 1944, the Germans had managed to disrupt these supply lines and encircle Allied forces in France. This left many soldiers without enough food and the necessary equipment. German troops quickly took advantage of this situation and reclaimed territories in France. They were supported by the Vichy government, a group in France that had collaborated with the Nazis since 1940. This made it easier for the Germans to move and recover lands. The Germans also revived an old plan to invade the United Kingdom known as Operation Sea Lion. Originally planned for 1940 but postponed, the idea was to attack the UK from French ports. The goal was to achieve a military victory and at the same time scare the Allies into reconsidering their commitment to continuing the war. As the war dragged on, people in the Allied countries began to tire of the conflict. By 1945, there was a strong desire to end the war in the US, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, France, and even China. Many were demanding that their governments find a peaceful solution, as they were weary of the death and economic hardships they had endured since 1939. The Allied leaders found themselves in a difficult position, trying to win the war while facing growing discontent at home. Talks of possible peace negotiations began to emerge, suggesting serious compromises. In Germany, the leaders were aware of this shift in public opinion and tried to use it to their advantage. They spread news of their recent victories and claimed that a Nazi-controlled Europe was inevitable. This was intended to demoralize the Allied forces and pressure their governments into entering peace talks. Despite these maneuvers, the overall situation remained uncertain. The German army, although it had gained some ground, was very overextended. The Soviet Union remained strong in Eastern Europe, and the US continued to provide key resources and weapons to the Allies. This alternate scenario of a Nazi victory, while speculative, is based on real strategies and events from the war. It examines the possible outcomes if certain key moments of World War II had favored Nazi Germany, which would have led to a radically different post-war Europe and indeed a new world order. Chapter 2: Dominion over Destiny, the New World Order. Under the hegemony of the Axis powers, had Germany won World War II, the global political and military structure would have been drastically transformed under Nazi domination. As early as the beginning of the war in 1939, Germany possessed one of the most advanced and powerful military machines in the world. By 1941, the German army, the Wehrmacht, commanded millions of soldiers and successfully employed blitzkrieg tactics to conquer vast areas of Europe. A victory would have further expanded Germany's borders, incorporating large regions such as the Western territories of the Soviet Union and all of Western Europe. This would have made the Greater German Reich one of the largest empires in history, both in terms of territorial extension and population. The exact figures would have depended on the circumstances at the war's end, but it is conceivable that the territory controlled by Germany could have stretched from the Atlantic coast of France to the Ural Mountains in Russia, and from the Arctic Circle in Norway to the Mediterranean in the south, encompassing hundreds of millions of people. In such a scenario, Germany would not only have maintained its military capabilities, but would have expanded them significantly. The country's population before the war in 1939 was around 69 million, and with the annexation of densely populated nations such as France and parts of the Soviet Union, it could have ruled over more than 200 million people, or even more. This demographic expansion would provide enormous human resources both to sustain a gigantic standing army and for an expansive workforce for war production. Politically, the Nazi regime would have attempted to consolidate its power through the direct Germanization of occupied territories or the installation of puppet governments loyal to Berlin. Countries like France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Norway, which were under German occupation during the war, would have likely been turned into satellite states with limited autonomy. Their political systems would have been restructured to align with Nazi ideology, which would probably entail the abolition of democratic institutions and their replacement with authoritarian structures. In Eastern Europe, where the Nazis applied stricter racial policies, the approach would have been even more brutal. The General Plan Ost foresaw the depopulation and subsequent colonization of large parts of Eastern Europe with ethnic Germans. The implementation of these plans would have resulted in drastic demographic changes and a reshaped political landscape to ensure German supremacy. The military aspect of a German victory would also have been of great significance. The German war machine was already highly advanced during World War II, with innovations such as the V-2 rocket, jet aircraft like the Messerschmitt Me 262, and significant advancements in armored vehicles and submarines. With a victory, Germany would likely have continued leading in military technology and would have invested massively in research and development. The continuation of programs like the V-2 could have led to the early development of ballistic missile technology and possibly even intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBM, by the 1950s, which would have dramatically altered the strategic military balance. In terms of troop strength, the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS peaked at over 13 million soldiers during the war. With the resources of an expanded empire, these numbers could have increased considerably, supported by a robust economy and access to the resources of an entire continent. This military power would have been used to maintain German control over occupied territories and deter possible uprisings or foreign interventions. The Kriegsmarine, which during the war had somewhat taken a back seat to the Wehrmacht, could have experienced expansion and a renewed focus. Control of European ports along the Atlantic and Mediterranean would provide the foundation for a powerful surface and submarine fleet, capable of projecting German power across the oceans and protecting maritime trade routes. The Luftwaffe, already a powerful air force, would have continued its development and likely led the world in jet aircraft and rocket technology. Establishing air superiority over the European continent and perhaps even parts of Asia and Africa would have been a realistic goal given the resources and technological base of a victorious Nazi Germany. In this alternate scenario, Germany would have emerged as a global superpower, with political and military influence extending far beyond its historical borders. Chapter 3: Eternal Night, the endless horror of the Holocaust in a world conquered by hatred. One of the most disturbing aspects of this hypothetical scenario would undoubtedly be the fate of those persecuted under Nazi ideology. The Holocaust, in which 6 million Jews, as well as millions of others deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime, including Romani people, people with disabilities, Slavs, and various ethnic and religious minorities, were murdered, could have continued unchecked and expanded in both its brutality and scope. Under a victorious Third Reich, it is likely that the systematic extermination policies carried out during the Holocaust would have persisted and intensified. Without Allied forces to liberate the camps or expose the atrocities, the knowledge and magnitude of these horrors would have largely remained hidden from the rest of the world. Extermination camps, a network of death factories across occupied Europe, could have increased in both number and efficiency. The Holocaust was driven by a deeply anti-Semitic ideology, backed by a pseudo-scientific belief in racial purity. This ideology was not limited to Germany. It also resonated in parts of occupied Europe, such as Croatia and Romania, where local governments collaborated with the Nazis to deport or murder their own Jewish populations and other minorities. In a world dominated by Nazi Germany, these sentiments likely would have been legitimized and even adopted by other nations under German influence or coercion. The continuation and possible expansion of eugenic policies could have led to the systematic eradication of all those deemed racially or genetically inferior by Nazi standards. This could have affected not only Jews and Romani people, but also black people, people with disabilities, Slavs, and even those with mental illnesses. It is estimated that, in addition to the 6 million Jews murdered, another 5 to 6 million people fell victim to Nazi eugenics policies, including Poles, Soviet prisoners of war, and disabled Germans through the Action T4 program. Had these policies not been halted, the total number of victims could have risen to tens of millions as the Nazi regime sought to cleanse the population under its control. The full implementation of the General Plan Ost, the Nazi plan for the colonization of Central and Eastern Europe, envisioned the expulsion, enslavement, or extermination of nearly all inhabitants of those regions to make way for German settlers. This plan alone could have resulted in the deaths of an additional 20 to 30 million people. With an Axis victory, the legal and moral frameworks that emerged after World War II, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Geneva Conventions, likely would never have been developed or enforced. The Nuremberg trials, which brought Nazi leaders to justice for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, almost certainly would not have occurred. Without these landmark moments of accountability, the international legal foundations for prosecuting such crimes would also have been absent. The absence of these trials and international legal norms could have created a global environment where human rights violations went unchecked and unpunished. This would have set a dangerous precedent, encouraging other nations to adopt similar policies without fear of reprisal. The ideology of racial superiority, rather than being condemned as one of the darkest chapters in human history, might have been normalized as a political tool in international relations. Moreover, the social and cultural repercussions of such unchecked atrocities would have been devastating. Educational systems under Nazi control would likely have taught a distorted version of history, glorifying the Reich and either concealing or denigrating the suffering of its victims. Generations of people would have grown up under an ideology that promoted hatred and devalued human life based on race and ethnicity. The long-term psychological effects on survivors and future generations would have been severe. In our reality, Holocaust survivors and those of other genocides often suffer from a range of long-term psychological issues, including post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, anxiety, and depression. In a world where these events were normalized or covered up, the trauma would have been compounded by the lack of recognition and support. The lack of justice for millions of victims would represent one of the darkest outcomes of this hypothetical scenario, with devastating consequences for global human rights and the fundamental pillars of international law and order. Chapter 4: A Silenced Continent, the Cultural Darkness of Europe. Under Nazi domination, Europe would have faced a completely different cultural and linguistic reality if Nazi Germany had won World War II. One of the most significant early changes would likely have been the imposition of German as the official language across the continent. In regions under direct Nazi control, schools would have been forced to teach in German, and all public signage, official documents, and media would have been in that language. This measure would aim to make German dominant, gradually displacing local languages and cultures. Over time, younger generations in these regions would have grown up with German as their primary language, while their native tongues would have been progressively forgotten. The effects on art would have been equally devastating. The Nazi regime had strict ideas about what art should represent. It favored art that promoted its ideals, such as paintings and sculptures glorifying the Aryan race, depicting heroic German soldiers, or celebrating the supposed achievements of the Nazi regime. Art that did not fit this narrow vision, such as modernism or abstract art, was labeled as degenerate art and banned. Museums that once housed a variety of artistic styles would have been cleansed of all works that did not align with Nazi ideology. Artists who continued to create such art would have faced severe punishment, including imprisonment or worse. The film industry, already heavily controlled by the Nazis during the war, would likely have become an even more powerful tool for spreading propaganda. Films would have been produced to glorify the Nazi regime and present it as the savior of Europe. These films would have portrayed Nazi soldiers as heroes, while any resistance to them would have been depicted as evil or futile. The rich diversity of European cinema, once filled with different styles and narratives, would have been replaced by a singular story that promoted Nazi ideals. With the growing Nazi control over culture, Many intellectuals, writers, and artists would likely have fled Europe, seeking refuge in countries like the United States, Canada, and possibly South America. This brain drain would have stripped Europe of its brightest and most creative minds. Many of these individuals would have continued their work in their new host countries, contributing to the cultural and intellectual life of those nations. Even during the war, many European scientists and intellectuals sought refuge in the United States, where they made significant contributions to art and science. This trend would likely have intensified if the Nazis had won, leading to a significant shift of cultural power from Europe to America. In Europe, the loss of these intellectuals and artists would have resulted in a decline in cultural diversity and creativity. Without the freedom to explore new ideas or challenge the status quo, European culture would likely have stagnated. Art, which was once a vibrant field of innovation and expression, would have been reduced to a tool of the state, with artists creating only works that met strict ideological guidelines. This would have led to a uniform cultural landscape with no room for dissent or diversity. The repression of free thought and forms of expression would have had long-term consequences for European society. In a world where only one perspective is allowed, innovation and creativity would have suffered. Literature, which had once been a source of new ideas and critical thinking, would have become another medium for propaganda. Books that questioned Nazi beliefs or promoted ideas such as democracy, freedom, or equality would have been banned. Authors who attempted to publish such works would have faced censorship, imprisonment, or worse. The education system would also have been profoundly affected. Schools and universities would have been required to teach Nazi ideology, and all subjects or ideas that did not align with that ideology would have been removed from the curriculum. History would have been rewritten to glorify the Nazi regime, while all facts or events that contradicted this narrative would have been erased. Students would have been indoctrinated to view the world through the lens of Nazi ideology, and critical thinking would have been discouraged. The final result would have been a culturally and intellectually impoverished Europe. The diversity of thoughts, languages, and forms of expression that once made Europe a hub of innovation and creativity would have been replaced by a rigid, uniform culture in service of the Nazi state. Over time, this would have led to a decline in Europe's global influence. Countries like the United States, which would have become home to many European exiles, likely would have assumed the role of cultural and intellectual leader, further weakening Europe's global standing. The loss of freedom in art and intellectual life would have caused a decline in creativity, innovation, and global impact, turning Europe into a shadow of what it once was. Chapter 5: Faith in the Shadows. The global repression of religion under Nazi rule. The Nazis had a complex and often hostile relationship with religion, using it for their own purposes while simultaneously attempting to alter or even replace established belief systems with their own ideology. In a world where the Nazis had triumphed, the future of major religions such as Christianity, Judaism, and Islam would have been grim. During the war, Nazi Germany was home to about 60 million Christians, split between Protestants and Catholics. However, the Nazi leadership, including Adolf Hitler, was deeply suspicious of Christianity. Hitler once described Christianity as the most fatal, seductive lie that ever existed. The Nazis saw traditional Christian values of compassion and humility as incompatible with their vision of a militaristic, racially pure society. Had they won the war, it is likely that the Nazis would have attempted to undermine Christianity and gradually replace it with a state-controlled belief system aligned with their ideals. One possible outcome would have been the promotion of a neo-pagan or quasi-religious ideology centered around the worship of Germanic gods, the glorification of the Aryan race, and the veneration of Nazi leaders, particularly Hitler. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, was deeply interested in Germanic paganism and sought to revive ancient rituals. The SS, which at its peak had more than 1 million members, frequently incorporated pagan symbols and ceremonies. In a Nazi-ruled world, this neo-paganism could have been elevated to the status of the official state religion, gradually replacing Christianity across Europe and potentially spreading globally. Judaism, which was the primary target of Nazi hatred during the Holocaust, would have faced complete extermination. The Holocaust claimed the lives of 6 million Jews, nearly two-thirds of Europe's Jewish population before the war. In a Nazi-dominated world, it is likely that the genocide against Jews would have continued unimpeded. The remaining Jewish communities in Europe, estimated at around 1 million by the end of the war, would have been eliminated. The Nazis could have expanded their genocidal campaign to Jewish populations in the Middle East, North Africa, and even the Americas, leading to the total annihilation of the Jewish people and the eradication of Judaism from history. Islam, too, would have faced significant challenges under Nazi rule. During the war, the Nazis formed strategic alliances with some Muslim leaders, primarily due to their shared anti-Semitic views. However, these alliances were opportunistic. The Nazi racist ideology regarded Arabs and other non-European peoples as inferior. In Nazi-influenced regions, predominantly Muslim territories, home to hundreds of millions of people, would likely have been subjected to oppressive racial policies. While it is possible that the Nazis would not have pursued a large-scale destruction of Islam similar to that inflicted on Jews, Islam would likely have been tightly controlled, with Nazi ideology infiltrating religious practices. The Catholic Church, which at the time had more than 400 million followers worldwide, would have been a major target for Nazi control. The Nazis' relationship with the Vatican during the war was tense. While some Catholic leaders collaborated or remained silent, others resisted, and many priests and nuns were persecuted or sent to concentration camps. In a post-Nazi world, the independence of the Vatican would likely have been severely restricted. The Pope and the Catholic hierarchy might have been forced to support Nazi policies, turning the Church into a tool of the regime. Any resistance within the Church would have resulted in widespread persecution, with thousands of priests and lay people potentially imprisoned or executed. Globally, Nazi influence would have posed a severe threat to religious freedom. Countries under Nazi control or influence would have been forced to suppress religious practices that did not align with Nazi beliefs. This would have resulted in the destruction of thousands of religious institutions, the banning of sacred texts like the Bible and the Quran, and the persecution of religious leaders across multiple continents. In regions such as Africa, Asia, and Latin America, where religious traditions were deeply rooted, Nazi religious policies could have had devastating effects, causing the loss of cultural heritage and spiritual practices that had existed for centuries. This grim outlook highlights how a Nazi victory would have devastated not only the major religions, but also the rich diversity of beliefs across the world, establishing an oppressive, unified ideology based on intolerance and violence. Chapter 6. A Divided World: The Fragile Balance of Power in Nazi-Dominated Europe. The geopolitical balance of Europe would have been drastically altered if Nazi Germany had won the war. The countries most affected by this outcome would have been France and the United Kingdom, due to their geographical proximity to Germany, historical rivalries, and significant economic interests. As the dominant power in Europe, Germany would have either directly occupied these nations or installed puppet governments that, while appearing democratic, would have been completely under Nazi control. For France, this likely would have meant a continuation and deepening of the Vichy regime, which had already collaborated with Nazi Germany during the war. Under Nazi domination, the French government would have lost all real autonomy, serving as a satellite state that provided the Reich with resources, labor, and strategic advantages. France's once strong economy would have been repurposed to support German interests, with industries redirected to sustain the Nazi war machine. France's rich cultural heritage would have suffered as well, as strict censorship and Nazi propaganda would have dominated the arts and education, promoting the regime's ideals. The United Kingdom, if it had fallen under Nazi control, would have experienced similar changes. Although in reality the invasion of Britain was avoided, in this alternate scenario the Nazis could have forced the British government to sign a peace agreement. Under a pro-Nazi regime, political freedoms in the UK would have eroded. A possible puppet government, led by collaborators or figures forced to comply, would have administered the country, but real power would have resided in Berlin. The British economy would have been directed toward the needs of the Reich, and British culture subjected to the same repressive controls as the rest of occupied Europe. The strategic importance of France and the United Kingdom cannot be underestimated. Controlling these countries would have given Germany access to significant resources, including France's agricultural production and industrial capabilities, as well as Britain's naval power and global trade networks. This would have cemented Germany's status as a global superpower, allowing it to project its influence far beyond Europe. The situation with the Soviet Union would have been more complex. An armistice with Germany would have politically weakened the Soviet Union, but the country's vast territory, harsh climate, and resilient population would have made total Nazi domination unlikely. The Nazis always viewed the Soviet Union as a key target for expansion, as outlined in the General Plan Ost, which proposed the colonization of Eastern Europe and the exploitation of its resources. However, the enormous logistical challenges and fierce Soviet resistance, coupled with the sheer size of the territory, would have made complete conquest nearly impossible. Instead, a more likely scenario would have been a divided Europe, with Nazi Germany dominating the West and the Soviet Union controlling much of the East. This would have created a tense and unstable environment, with a high potential for future conflicts. The borders between these two superpowers would have become the front lines of a new and dangerous stalemate, possibly similar to the Cold War. The risk of nuclear conflict would have been particularly high, especially if both powers had advanced in the development of nuclear weapons as a means of deterrence and power expansion. In this tense European reality, the United States would have found itself in a unique position. The Atlantic Ocean would have served as a natural barrier, isolating the US from the immediate threats of Nazi Europe. However, the geopolitical reality of a Nazi-dominated Europe would have forced the US to engage diplomatically and militarily to maintain global stability. The US would likely have sought to counter Nazi Germany through alliances with other nations, or by supporting resistance movements within Europe. The situation in the Pacific would have also been crucial. Japan, as the last remaining Axis power, would have continued its aggressive expansion in Asia. The United States, already preparing for a prolonged conflict with Japan, would likely have intensified its military efforts in the Pacific. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki might still have occurred, but the global context would have been different. While the US used its presence in Japan to contain Japanese expansion, it would also have had to help contain Nazi Europe. Despite Japan's strength, it would eventually have been contained by the combined efforts of the US and Soviet forces in Asia. On a global scale, Nazi domination would have had far-reaching consequences. Countries around the world would have been caught in a new world order where Nazi ideology was the dominant force. Nations in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, which were not directly controlled by Germany, would have felt pressure to adapt to Nazi policies to avoid conflict or economic isolation. The effects of a Nazi victory would have extended far beyond Europe, reshaping global alliances and potentially sparking new conflicts as countries struggled to navigate or resist the new balance of power. This hypothetical scenario has also served as the basis for numerous speculative fiction works, where authors have imagined the long-term consequences of a Nazi victory. Works like The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick and Fatherland by Robert Harris explore worlds where Nazi ideology has permeated global culture and politics, often highlighting the inherent contradictions and eventual unsustainability of such a regime. In these stories, totalitarian control of society, the elimination of cultural diversity, and the dehumanization of entire populations are central themes that reveal the dangers of unchecked power. An armistice that left Nazi Germany in control of Europe would have led to a deeply divided and unstable world. The reality that would have emerged from such a scenario would be one of constant tension, where the danger of a new global conflict was never far beneath the surface. Chapter 7: Empires of Oppression, the Colonial World Under Nazi Rule. Before and during the war, European powers such as the United Kingdom, France, and the Netherlands controlled vast colonial territories in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, with a total population exceeding 600 million people. These colonies were rich in resources essential to the economies of their European colonizers. A Nazi victory would have reshaped these empires, delaying or even halting the decolonization process that followed the war. In 1939, the British Empire was the largest in history, covering over 13 million square miles and governing more than 400 million people. Among its most important colonies was India, with a population of around 350 million, as well as large territories in Africa, including Egypt, Sudan, and South Africa. France also controlled significant colonial territories, governing over 110 million people in Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Caribbean. The Netherlands, though smaller, dominated the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, home to about 70 million people and a crucial source of oil, rubber, and tin. In a world where Nazi Germany had triumphed, these colonial empires would have faced immense pressure from the Third Reich. Nazi ideology, based on the concept of Lebensraum, living space, emphasized German territorial expansion. While this concept primarily focused on Eastern Europe, a victorious Nazi regime would likely have set its sights on the colonies of its European rivals, especially in resource-rich regions like Africa and the Middle East, which were crucial for sustaining the German Empire. Africa, with its abundant resources, would have been of particular interest to the Nazis. The continent was a critical source of minerals like gold, diamonds, and copper, as well as agricultural products such as rubber and cotton. For example, the Belgian Congo produced 75% of the world's cobalt, and South Africa was a major gold producer, supplying about 40% of the global market. The Nazis, who had shown interest in establishing a colonial presence in Africa even before the war, would have sought control over these resources. British colonies like Egypt and South Africa, both strategic and resource-rich, would have been prime targets. The United Kingdom, with its 10 million square miles of colonial territory, would have faced enormous pressure to cede these lands to the Nazis or risk military confrontation. French colonies in North and West Africa, including Algeria, with a population of about 7 million, Tunisia and Senegal, would have been equally vulnerable. During the war, the Vichy regime, which collaborated with Nazi Germany, maintained control over these colonies. In a post-war scenario, with the Nazis victorious, these colonies might have been ceded to Germany as part of a broader redistribution of colonial territories. The French colonial empire, weakened by the war, could have been completely dismantled, with its territories divided between Germany and other Axis powers like Italy, which had its own ambitions in North Africa. The Netherlands, which controlled the Dutch East Indies, would have faced a similar fate. These islands were a vital source of oil, producing more than 60 million barrels annually before the war, as well as rubber, which accounted for 25% of the world's production. Japan, one of the Axis powers, had already occupied the Dutch East Indies during the war. In a world where the Axis powers won, Japan could have retained control of these territories, or Germany might have claimed the East Indies as part of its imperial expansion. The impact of a Nazi victory on the process of decolonization would have been enormous. In reality, the end of World War II marked the beginning of the decolonization movements, with many former colonies gaining independence in the following decades. For example, India achieved independence in 1947 and Indonesia in 1949. However, in a world dominated by Nazi Germany, this process likely would have been delayed or even completely halted. Nazi ideology considered non-European peoples to be inferior, and the regime had no interest in granting independence or self-determination to colonized populations. Instead of moving toward independence, the colonies likely would have been subjected to even more intense exploitation and control. In Africa, for instance, the Nazis might have implemented policies similar to those used in the occupied territories of Eastern Europe, where local populations were displaced, enslaved, or killed to make way for German settlers. Indigenous populations in the colonies of Africa and Asia would have faced brutal repression as their lands and resources were confiscated to benefit the Nazi Empire. Rather than progressing toward independence, the colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East would likely have been absorbed into a new world empire controlled by the Nazis. The decolonization process, which defined much of Chapter 8, Total Dominion, the Nazi technological machinery of surveillance and control. Had Nazi Germany won World War II, technology would have been central to maintaining its control over the population. Even during the war, the Nazis were pioneers in using technology for propaganda and control, and after a victory, they would have significantly expanded these efforts to create a state of total surveillance. This would have had far-reaching consequences for people under their rule and for the rest of the world. During the war, the Nazi regime made extensive use of radio, cinema, and print media to spread propaganda. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi Minister of Propaganda, controlled the messages delivered to the German people. By 1939, nearly 70% of German households owned a radio called the Volksempfänger, designed specifically to receive only broadcasts approved by the Nazis. This allowed the regime to control the flow of information and ensure that only its narrative was heard. In a post-Nazi world, this control would have extended to all forms of communication, with even more advanced technologies used to monitor and manipulate public opinion. One key area where the Nazis would have intensified their surveillance measures was the use of early computational technologies. During the war, the Nazis were already experimenting with data processing techniques and used IBM punch card machines to manage information about millions of people, including prisoners in concentration camps. These machines were used to monitor everything from labor distribution to the extermination of prisoners. With victory, the Nazis would have heavily invested in the development of more advanced computational systems, paving the way for an early version of a digital surveillance state. By the 1950s, the Nazis likely would have developed advanced data storage and processing systems. These could have been used to create detailed databases on every individual within the Reich. The Gestapo, the Nazi secret police, would have had access to this information, allowing them to monitor and control the population with unprecedented precision. Surveillance would have extended to all aspects of life, from employment and housing to personal relationships and political beliefs. In addition to internal surveillance, the Nazis would likely have expanded their efforts to monitor global communication. During the war, the Nazis developed advanced encryption machines such as the Enigma to protect their military communications. With further technological advances, the Nazis could have developed even more complex encryption and decryption systems, enabling them to intercept and decipher communications from other nations. This would have given them a significant advantage in maintaining their dominance and detecting potential threats. The Nazis also experimented with early forms of electronic surveillance. For example, during the war, they used listening devices and hidden microphones to spy on both their enemies and their own citizens. In a post-Nazi world, these efforts would have been greatly expanded. By the 1960s, widespread use of listening devices, hidden cameras, and other surveillance equipment in homes, workplaces, and public spaces could have been implemented. The Nazi regime would have used these technologies to ensure that any form of resistance was detected and quickly suppressed. In terms of scale, millions of people could have been under constant surveillance. During the war, Germany had a population of about 80 million people. After a victory, the number of people controlled would have grown to hundreds of millions across Europe and beyond. Even if only a fraction of this population was closely monitored, the surveillance apparatus would have reached enormous proportions. The Gestapo, which had around 32,000 members during the war, could have grown into a much larger organization, with tens of thousands of employees dedicated to maintaining the surveillance state. The psychological effects of living under constant surveillance would have been profound. People would have lived in constant fear of being watched at all times, leading to widespread paranoia and self-censorship. This environment would have stifled any form of dissent or resistance, as even the slightest deviation could have resulted in severe punishment. The Nazis, known for their brutality, would have used this surveillance apparatus to maintain strict control over the population and ensure that their ideology remained unquestioned. Globally, the influence of Nazi surveillance technology could have extended beyond their borders. Countries under Nazi control or influence may have adopted similar surveillance technologies, creating a world where privacy would have virtually ceased to exist. International relations would have been deeply affected, as nations would have feared that their communications were being intercepted and analyzed by the Nazis. In summary, Nazi technological control would not only have ensured internal dominance, but would also have extended its reach to monitor and manipulate global communication. This hypothetical scenario illustrates how a totalitarian regime could have used technology to consolidate its power and control every aspect of human life.